I'm so appreciative for the opportunity to be with you today. And let's see. Oh, I need to be able to share my screen, I think.
Yep, you got it.
Got it. Okay, let's try that again. Oops. Not quite.
Hold on just 1 second.
So while she's doing that, I'd love to have you all just type into the chat how you're feeling right now. 1 or 2 words to describe how you're feeling right now. Hungry. Oh yes. What? No lunch? Eager to learn. Great. Great. Excellent. Overwhelmed. So much we're dealing with. So much you've heard so far. Tired but good. Excellent. Hopeful. Glad I'm having coffee and excited to learn. Excellent. This is helpful to me, so I know how you all are feeling, and I can adjust my comments appropriately. For present and interested from Leslie. Excellent. 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 Tired but engaged. Excellent. Thanks. Thankful and curious. Glad to be here from Sophie. Great.
And James, you should be able to share your screen now.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. And ready from Jared. So with that, I think we are ready. And I'm sharing my screen. Let me know if you can see it, please. Excellent. Okay. I love starting my presentations off. And really, this is not so much a presentation, but a conversation. I love to have lots of engagement. And I learn many times just as much from conversations like we're about to have as folks who participate learn. So please don't be shy. I know we've got 85 people in the room on the call, so that's fantastic. So feel free to type into the chat, and as Jennifer said, we'll be breaking out into breakouts during the time we have together. So starting off with, I love to put up a little cartoon. I love a little humor, but humor that's related to the topic at hand. So I'm going to give you a minute to look at these little cartoons, and then I have a question for you. And that question is, what is the underlying issue in each of these photos? There's an obvious issue, a couple of obvious things going on here, but there's something underlying going on here. What is it that's underlying? So we have denial, perspective, systemic discrimination, ignorance, power imbalance, privilege, bigotry, unknowing. Great one from Renee, unknowing. Let's see, they're in denial of the actual situation. Yes. Arrogance. Yes. Blind spots. Absolutely. Avoidance in one case. Yes. So all those are absolutely what's going on here. And a point that I really like to make that's a common thread through all of these, and they don't see the problem, a lack of accountability. The people in power are not recognizing whoever it is that's in front of them, the woman or the man of color, or even the white male locked outside the door. They're not recognizing the value that these people are bringing to the table. That's the key concept here that we really want to get across. There's value in everyone. Everyone has value, but it's the people in power, people in the positions of power who need to recognize that. So people in power are being discriminatory without recognizing. So I have some objectives for this session. that are to help you to understand what preconceived notions, unconscious implicit bias are, and how they influence our behavior. How to interpret types of microaggressions and their impact. We'll talk about what microaggressions are shortly. And to understand how you can address discrimination that occurs because of these preconceived notions that we have. We'll do that by looking at some conversational norms that you might establish. We'll talk about what welcoming and belonging means. What does it mean to be welcoming? What does it mean to feel like you belong? What does it mean to create a belonging environment? We'll talk about some barriers to addressing discrimination as we look at, after we've looked at how do you recognize it. We'll talk about how do you overcome some of those barriers? How do you address discrimination? And then a wrap up. So that's what I have in mind, but I also always love to hear from my audience. What questions do you have? What is it that you would like for me to talk about in this limited amount of time we have together? Because I could talk on this for a week. I could teach on this for a week. I could have conversations for a week. But I want to make sure that what I say is going to answer the questions that you have. So feel free to type in the chat. What questions do you have that you'd like for me to make sure I at least say a little something about if I can? All right, we have a couple of chats coming in. Recognizing unconscious bias. How do you recognize it, I guess? Okay, what is one step we can take tomorrow to address racism? Okay, we'll get to that. Anyone else? How do we reconcile and deal with one's own biases? Excellent question, and we will talk about that. How do you address performance activism? Ooh, there's an interesting one. I'll try to say a little something about that. That's a big one. How one's social power can influence structural power. Wow, these are some really good topics. All right, I'll try to say something about that. Structural power. I will say something about that. How do you acknowledge discrimination without the other person becoming defensive? That's actually a great topic, and that's what I'm going to cover in the How to Have Difficult Conversations session I'm going to do on Wednesday. How can we support others who share their discrimination experience privately? Wow. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to talk much about that one here, but I'll try to keep that one in mind. How to properly speak when you are in a conversation or situation where the person is overtly discriminatory. That's another one that we're going to talk about when I talk about how to have difficult conversations. But great question to ask. Okay, great. Thank you for that. That helps me to shape what I'm about to cover with you. So first of all, let's talk about what it means to feel like you belong. And actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to stop sharing. This is the breakouts time. We're going to put you into, what do we say, groups of, two, did we say? 2 and 3? And I'd like to ask you to share what characteristics to you mean that you feel welcome, that you feel like you belong? What characteristics to you make it feel like you're welcome and that you belong?
And James, how long would you like the breakout room to be for?
So for this, the breakout rooms are 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. So we're going to push you into breakout rooms. It will automatically put you in groups of 2 to 3. If you get a pop-up that says you're being asked to join, please click on that pop-up. And in the breakout, we really appreciate it if you would turn your cameras on to have a true conversation with the other participants. And you'll get a 60-second notice on when the room is about to end. So you can either come back right then or get 60 seconds to real quick finish up your conversation. So are you ready? Here we go. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for participating in the breakout. So James, how would you like to debrief that breakout?
So what I would love to do is to have folks just share, just throw out, and you can type it into the chat, what did you come up with? What are the characteristics that make you feel welcome and you belong? So we have Larry, eye contact, humor and a smile, inclusivity, listening, asking questions about each other, engagement, curiosity, feeling that you can share openly, openness, a verbal greeting makes you feel welcome, a smile, space and language to speak, paying close attention, great, listening and caring, checking in, introduction, making an introduction, one-on-one speaking, excellent. Asking pronouns. Oh, there's a great one. Asking pronouns. Making personal connection. Asking how are you more often than once to get a real answer. How are you? No, how are you really? Okay. Active listening. Excellent. Knowing one person. Knowing one person there makes you feel like you belong or you're welcome. All right, so from some of the research that's been done, a feeling of welcomeness and belonging, and you all nailed the characteristics, right? Of course we can, because we know these things, right? This is not rocket science. We know these things. So research has shown that there's a mental component and a physical component to welcomeness and belonging. Right? And there is this compositional diversity concept. We feel like we belong and we're welcome when there are people who look like us. C.E. Garcia, in a paper she wrote last year, identified 5 primary characteristics of belonging. They are where you have a role and responsibility, where people look like you, where you feel valued and cared for, where your racial identity or culture is recognized and valued, and where you share interests with one another. So the welcoming piece was, how do I feel when I enter into a group? Do I feel welcome? Are people saying hello to me? Are they asking how I am? The feeling like I belong is these characteristics we were just talking about as well. So in the context of recognizing discrimination, putting yourself into the other person's shoe and asking, do they feel these characteristics? Do they have the sense that they feel welcomed? Do they have the sense that they belong? If not, there's a little flag there that they may be experiencing discrimination. So I have a phrase that I use to describe a welcoming organization, a welcoming place, a place where people feel like they belong, which happens to also coincide with the characteristics of high-performing organizations. These kinds of organizations, I say, exhibit equitable inclusion of diverse people. Equitable inclusion, not just equal inclusion. And there is a difference. Some of you may have seen this little cartoon with the 3 panels with 3 youths who in one panel are given the same box to see over a fence, to see a baseball game. That's equal treatment. The panel where they're given each boxes appropriate to helping them see over the fence is equitable. They're being treated equitably. They're being given what they need, right? This third panel is showing something a little bit different. Some people would say equity because they're being treated equally, but others would say this might be justice because there's no barrier in the first place. There's no need for assistance. So we think about equitable inclusion, right? Creating a situation that's equitable for people. And this inclusion piece, a definition I love of inclusion comes from the Association for Physical Assistance. It includes the words active, ongoing engagement with people. That's inclusion, active, intentional, ongoing engagement. And then there's this diverse people part. What is diversity? Well, we tend to think about diversity as racial diversity or gender diversity. But Marilyn Lober in 1991 identified diversity using the model of what she called the diversity wheel. And that diversity wheel describes characteristics of our personalities. There are some characteristics that are primary to us or internal to us that we have all of our lives that don't change: our race, our gender, our age. And then we have secondary or external characteristics, those characteristics of our personality that do change over our lifetimes, albeit not necessarily every minute of every day, but some, yes, every minute of every day. Our appearance, our income, our education, our religion, our ways of thinking. So if we use the term, if we define the term diversity using this diversity wheel instead of just race or gender, we're opening ourselves up to a whole host of other possibilities. And so packaging all this together, welcoming, inclusive, high-performing organizations exhibit equitable, not equal, equitable inclusion, active, ongoing, intentional engagement of diverse people. So recognizing discrimination is all about thinking about the vision of having a welcoming, belonging environment. And asking ourselves, does everyone feel like they belong? Does everyone feel like they're welcome? If not, there's a flag that discrimination may be happening. So I have 3 pictures for you. And I'm curious, do people recognize these pictures and the significance of these pictures? What's the significance of these pictures? And there is a New Hampshire significance around discrimination for each of these pictures. Feel free to type into the chat. Actually, this one, you know what? Let's play the come off the mute game. Anybody recognize these? Raise your hands and just share what you know about any of these pictures. Or type it into the chat, either one.
Well, I recognize the high school because my son went there.
All right, but there is a significance around discrimination with that high school.
Yeah, and you kind of got me stumped on it. Obviously, the Confederate flag. I mean,
right. So I'll go ahead and do the reveal. All right, somebody type something in to chat here. Let's see. The jingle, yes. Yes, Ashley got it. Yes, the jingle. So a couple of years ago, a history teacher was teaching on the Reconstruction period after the Civil War and asked the students to write jingles. And one group wrote a jingle about the Ku Klux Klan, and they performed it in class, and it went viral. Offended a number of people. So that was an example of discrimination that happened in a school. The picture of the young boy is, this happened about 3 years ago in Claremont, New Hampshire. This young boy, who was 8 years old at the time, was taken to the hospital with rope burns around his neck. He was playing with some of his friends, and they were playing hanging a rope from a tree and jumping from a picnic table with the rope around their neck. Needless to say, this was not something that parents had necessarily taught the kids about, yet they knew about it anyway. This third picture is, yes, indeed, a Confederate flag, but it is a very specific Confederate flag. It is a Confederate flag with holes in it, which are burn marks. And this flag was found in the mailbox of an African-American family 2 years ago in the town in which I live, which is Goffstown. The FBI is currently on the case trying to find the perpetrator. Pardon me? Did someone ask something? Oh, all right. So this is discrimination that's happened very recently here in New Hampshire. This is, you can recognize that it's happened with these situations, and keeping up with the news, you recognize what's going on. The motivations are implicit bias, which we'll talk more about shortly. So those were interpersonal examples. Let's take a look at some systemic examples. Anyone recognize this map that's at the top left-hand corner of the screen? Feel free to type it in the chat or raise your hand if you do. Let's see, we have a few people typing in the chat. Redlining, yes. So this map is actually a map of Manchester, New Hampshire from the 1940s. And it is the map that represents the redlining that occurred. Redlining was a practice that was actually law in many places around the country, including Manchester, in the 1940s, 1950s, which said that people of color could not buy property or get loans in specifically designated areas of cities or towns, because people in power did not want people of color in any areas except those areas where they wanted them to be. And if you know of anything about Manchester today, you will notice that some of these areas that are in red, the hazardous areas where people of color were allowed to live, are the areas today that you would probably not want to go into because they're not as well developed. So the legacy of this practice, and after it was outlawed, even in 1964 with the civil rights laws, the remnants of those actions, of those laws, were carried on for decades afterwards. There were still policies and procedures that banks adhered to and real estate agents adhered to for not selling to people of color in those areas. So this next chart on the right is actually a chart of the COVID cases. We know, because of the data that's been captured, that even though New Hampshire is a state which is 90% white, that only 73% of the COVID cases were made up by white people. even though the population of New Hampshire is 1.5% African American, African Americans made up 5.8% of the cases. Latinx citizens in New Hampshire make up 2.8% of the population, but 5.4% of the cases. So our healthcare system shows systemic discrimination. It's because of lack of access and historical lack of access and lack of the ability to maintain a healthy living style by people of color. Education. We know that there are students in the Manchester School District, students of color, who are not able to take AP classes. They're encouraged not to take or discouraged from taking AP classes. And there aren't that many AP classes that exist to begin with in the Manchester School District. So the system's not encouraging people of color to get the highest education possible. The education rates are not the same. So there's systems in place there that need to be addressed. Criminal justice. How many of you learned to drive with your hands at the 10 and 2 position in the steering wheel? Raise your hand if you learned to drive with your position to 10 and 2 in the steering wheel. Some of us may be old enough to be taught 9 and 3s when you put your hand, but 10 and 2. So we have a law enforcement system that allowed Brian Perez in 2018 to be pulled over because he was driving suspiciously with his hands at 10 and 2 at the steering wheel. The system allowed that to happen. Systemic failure of protecting a person of color. There are any numerous other examples that I could share with you about the criminal justice system. The rates of incarceration of people of color in New Hampshire far outstrip the population demographics. So this is discrimination at the systemic level here in New Hampshire. This is how you recognize it, by looking at those statistics and seeing those disparities. Okay. So what's the cause of all of this? Let's talk about some attributes of discrimination. This is some language that will help you understand what discrimination is and how to recognize it a little bit better, especially in ourselves. And I'm discriminatory. I will be one of the first to admit it. I try not to be, but I'm a human. So first of all, we as humans, we generalize. We have so much information coming into our brains from our 5 senses. And some of us think we have a 6th sense, and we sometimes do. We have so much information coming in. How does our brain process all of that? We process it by generalizing. We formulate general concepts. We abstract from all this information that's coming in at us, all this data that's coming in at us. We look for common properties of instances. We stereotype. We create an incomplete picture, a distorted picture in our head of people because we generalize. We also tend to place value judgments on people just by the way they look. So we are prejudiced. We place a value judgment based on our feelings associated with the stereotype. Where do those feelings come from? They come from this notion of unconscious implicit bias. The experiences that we have, what we are taught, influences how we make generalizations of the world, influences how we stereotype, and influences how we judge what we see. So we are taught through the media, through behavior that we see, that people of color are not as valuable. We are taught, we've been taught in many cases, that women are not as smart as men, don't have the same characteristics, are weaker than men. So since we've been taught that, we have that in our heads. It's rattling around when we encounter someone. It's what we generalize about women. It's what we generalize about Black males. And that influences our actions. And that's discrimination, taking an action based on your prejudice. And the kinds of actions that many of us take are microaggressions. And we'll talk about those in just more in detail in just a minute. These are verbal utterances or actions that are taken based on prejudice. This discrimination, when there's a power dynamic involved, becomes an ism, a destructive ism. It's where power is used to reinforce discrimination and prejudice in the institutions and groups to which we belong. And this is where the notion of white privilege and white normalcy or white normativeness comes into play. This power dynamic occurs in society because of the white normativeness. And we have to look at this at individual level, which we talked about interpersonal discrimination and systemic discrimination. So structures are built, systems are built that are discriminatory. And we don't even necessarily know or think that they're discriminatory, but they are. Okay. So just kind of breaking down what discrimination really means and how it happens, why it happens. I want to next delve a bit into, all right, let me say a few more words about unconscious bias. From a physiological perspective, this happens from the base part of our brain called the amygdala. Because all of our senses, our sense of sight, smell, touch, all of that feeds into the primary part of our brain called the amygdala. And as soon as that data comes in, we react to it. We react to it in what is referred to as the fight, flight, or freeze model. Anybody heard of that model before? Anybody who studies psychology has probably heard of the fight, flight, or freeze model. As soon as we see something that's different from us, someone who's different from us, who might be a danger, cortisol flows through our bodies. The amygdala is connected with our the limbic system that flows that cortisol through our brains because we're ready to fight, flight, or freeze. And what we want to have happen is we want to train ourselves to allow our cortex to take over, that frontal part of our brain, that's our logic centers of our brain, which can override the reaction of the fight, flight, or freeze that happens in our amygdala. So what studies have shown is that if we understand what's going on physiologically in our bodies, we actually can control it better. And that's why I explain a little bit about what's going on in our brain. When we see somebody who's different from us with this understanding of how our brain works, we're better able to control our reactions. Okay, so we've been going for a bit. Time to get into some microaggressions, some examples. So if I were to say to you, if I were to say to an Asian American, gee, I'm having problems with my math assignment. Can you help me? That is a microaggression. Anybody know why? Because I've made an assumption. I've made an assumption based on just what's been out there in the world. It's a stereotype. Yes, it plays on a stereotype. The stereotype that all Asians are good at math. Therefore, the person in front of me must be good at math and can help me with my mathematics. Okay. That's a microaggression that I just made. As Chester Pierce, who coined the term in 1970, said, microaggressions are subtle insults and put downs, and he was referring to African Americans being experienced those subtle insults and put downs. But this concept can be used for not just African Americans. Think about any of the characteristics that we talked about in Marilyn Lober's definition of diversity wheel. Any slights, any subtle insults or put downs based on those characteristics can be termed a microaggression. So microaggressions generally take three forms: verbal, behavioral, or even environmental. So the one that I just shared with you is verbal. It's a verbal microaggression. And as it turns out, there are actually 9 types of microaggressions. The one I just shared with you was ascription of intelligence. I'm assuming that this Asian American is good at math. If I were to ask a person who is a brown person, where are you from? If that person said, oh, I'm from Concord, and then I were to ask, no, where are you really from? I just committed another microaggression. What's going on behind that microaggression? Anybody? You can probably guess which one that is up at the top here that I'm showing on the screen. Yeah, and the assumption is that person's not from here. That's the alien in our own land microaggression. It's discrimination. This third one of colorblindness, this is an interesting one because in the 70s and late 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, the goal was to be colorblind, right? I don't see color. Well, why is that a microaggression though? Go back to that first cartoon that I mentioned. If you don't see my color, you don't see my individuality and my experience. And as Abby says it really well, just denying anyone else's experiences. Right? That's discrimination. Denial of racism. If someone says, well, I'm not racist, I have a black friend. Just because you have a black friend doesn't mean you're not racist. And actually, you know what, I tend to not think of people as being racist. I look at the behavior. It's racist behavior. We all exhibit racist behavior. We all should be judged not by the worst things we do. Myth of meritocracy. If I were to say to Indian doctor, a doctor of Indian descent. Oh, your people must be proud of you. Sorry, wrong example. The myth of meritocracy is where someone has the opinion that, well, if you just work hard enough, you can get ahead. Right? If you hear that statement, that's someone who's being discriminatory, because they don't recognize the barriers that people face, people of color face, that women face, that people with disabilities face. Pathologizing cultural and value styles. If I were to say that a person of color is not getting by because all people of color are lazy, that's pathologizing a culture, virtual or style. If I were to, let me back up. So Melody Hobson, who is the CFO of a large financial management firm in New York, tells a story of going to speak at a grand hotel in New York. And she walked into the hotel. She was dressed in her business outfit, and she ran into a staff person at the hotel who, before she could open her mouth, escorted her, said, "Oh, great, you're here," escorted her back to the kitchen and showed her a uniform to put on to help with the serving. So that was an assumption that was made that this Black woman was not the person who was going to be speaking at the conference, but was the person who's going to be helping with the conference, that she was a second-class citizen. Environmental discrimination. So, anybody know the story of I-291 in Worcester? Why it was placed where it was placed? It was placed there because that was the least disruptive to the communities that were more privileged. It went right through an African-American community. So the environment was being utilized in a way that was detrimental to people of color. Another example of that is around names on buildings. Do you know of any buildings in New Hampshire named after Black males? What message does that send to people of color? That they're not able to accomplish things that are worthy of having a name built after them? And this last one, assumption of criminal status. I probably don't even have to explain this one, but have you ever been walking down the street and seen a Black man coming towards you, maybe dressed in a hoodie? What's your reaction? What's your immediate reaction? If you immediately walk to the other side of the street to avoid walking by that person, you just assume that that person is bad and maybe a criminal and may not be worth just walking by. So these are all examples of microaggressions and discrimination. If you see them or hear them, you know what they are. So next, I want to talk a bit about barriers. Barriers to creating a welcoming, inclusive organization and environment, and barriers to using what we call an equity lens, that equitable inclusion of diverse people. We've already talked a bit about unconscious bias, unconscious implicit bias. I want to talk a little bit about the wages of whiteness. and white privilege. Then I want to talk a bit about behavioral codification and cycles of socialization, and then the lack of everyday courage that prevents us from acting in ways that are not discriminatory. So unconscious bias, I've actually talked about that, so I have a little video that I sometimes show, but I'm not going to show it at the moment. I want to talk about wages of whiteness. Wages of Whiteness draws on the seminal work of W.E.B. Du Bois, his book, Black Reconstruction in America, to argue that whites' racial animus is grounded ultimately in whites' attempt to secure a public and psychological wage. So if you think about it, white people created this race culture. And they created it because they needed to have people do work for them and needed to feel better. There's a lot of history that's been identified of people in Europe, white people in Europe, being traumatized because they did not have the resources they needed to be successful. So when the Pilgrims came over from Europe, from England, they felt the need to somehow be superior. And they figured out how to do it through bringing slaves to the United States. And they wanted to maintain this power dynamic over time. And that's why when slavery went out, when slavery was finally outlawed after the Civil War, Jim Crow laws were established. The police force was created. Anyone really know the history of the police? At least in the Eastern United States, it was to keep Black people in their place. That was the origin of the police here. Now, it has changed over time. Right? To protect and serve has become the motto, and that's what most police do. But the origins are still there. The culture of supremacy is still there. So there's this psychological wage that Du Bois talked about that is one of the reasons why we have this racial discrimination today. Peggy McIntosh, in her essay on white privilege, talks about it being an invisible package of unearned assets. And I actually like to talk about this in terms of white normativeness. Our society is built around white being the norm, and in many cases around male being the norm, around able-bodied being the norm. When it comes to race, we can think of the example of going into a hotel. We rent a hotel room, we go to the bathroom in the hotel room, there's a shampoo bottle there, complimentary shampoo bottle, and you think, great, complimentary shampoo. Whose hair does that shampoo work on? Does it work on the hair of people of color? Probably not. The assumption was that the person going to this hotel is going to be white. And that shampoo is going to work for them. So this is as I said, I talk about white normativeness, which is what creates the privilege of not having to worry about the shampoo working on your hair, as an example. So it's a barrier. It's discrimination at a systemic level, an unintentional systemic level. So this gets me to the discussion about codification, behavioral codification and reinforcement. Our culture reinforces discrimination. And I love Resmaa Menakem, who wrote My Grandmother's Hands. His description of culture is how our bodies retain and reenact history through the foods we eat, the stories we tell, the things that hold meaning for us, and the images we hold dear. So our culture is discriminatory in many cases, white normative. The policies and procedures that we put in place in our organizations, which codify behavior, are unintentionally discriminatory because our organizations are made up of people, and people have implicit bias. Our laws are unintentionally discriminatory, or sometimes intentionally, as we're starting to see from some of the legislation that's going through our legislature this week, this legislative session. So these are reasons why, these are the barriers to overcoming discrimination. And they are, in many cases, discriminatory in and of themselves. So how do we address discrimination? Well, I have some thoughts to share. How many of you are familiar with the work of Carol Dweck from Stanford University and the growth mindset? Some of you are. Yeah. So Professor Dweck talks about a mindset where you recognize you don't know everything. You want to learn, you thrive from learning. You don't think you have all the answers. Next, embracing difference. Not being afraid of difference, embracing difference. And having some conversational norms that I'll talk about in just a minute, and how you engage with anyone. People the same as you are, people different than you are. Debiasing yourself. There are 9 techniques for debiasing. I actually have a workshop that I teach those 9 techniques for debiasing. We understand that we have unconscious implicit bias. How do we debias ourselves? You understand how to have difficult conversations. We had a couple of questions at the beginning about how do I engage with people who are discriminatory. Right? Those are difficult conversations, so we'll talk about those in the next session. Having everyday courage. I'll talk about what everyday courage is in just a moment. And using an equity lens in decision making and problem solving. So I want to talk about very quickly some conversational norms, because you can employ these in your conversations with people, and with individuals and with groups, and as you engage with the world. First of all, stay engaged in these difficult conversations. If you're in a difficult conversation, don't shy away from it. Stay engaged. Share airtime. If you're in a conversation, let the other person speak. Let the other people speak if you've got more than one person. The notion here is you're and we said it before, active listening. You're listening to people. Be patient with yourself and others. You don't have experiences that allow you to really understand what someone else might be going through. And that's okay. You're a different person. Be patient with yourself in understanding other people. And be patient with others who are trying to understand you. Speak your truth as you are able. Make I statements. Don't try to speak someone else's truth. Notice your judgments. We're not saying don't have judgments. We're saying notice your judgments. And where do we talk about judgments before? We talked about them a little while ago. Type in the chat or come off mute. Where did we talk about judgments before? Anyone remember? Implicit bias, the attributes of discrimination. Yes. We tend to make judgments. We stereotype and then we discriminate. We have prejudice. We act or make judgments, value judgments based on our stereotypes. We're all teachers and we're all learners. This is the growth mindset, right? We all have something to teach. We all have something to learn. Respecting confidentiality. Sometimes with a difficult conversation, you want to make it so that someone feels vulnerable enough to say something, to say how they truly feel without you retaliating. Expect and accept non-closure. You may not resolve your situation. This racism thing has been around for over 400 years. We're not going to resolve it today, tomorrow, maybe not even our lifetimes. Expect and accept non-closure. Doesn't mean you don't try, but don't expect necessarily to solve the world's problems around racism. Then oops and ouch. This is a neat tool to use in a conversation. Someone says something that hits you wrong. You don't have to say, well, you just offended me. You could say, ouch. Just say, ouch. Let the other person ask, what does that mean? Stop them in their tracks. Make them think about what they just said. Conversely, if you say something that as soon as it leaves your lips, you recognize that it didn't quite come out the way you wanted it to come out, you can say, oops. That lets the other person know that your intent may have been different than its impact. And we do separate intent from impact. All right. So, communications. The Shannon and Weaver created a model around communications that talks about the sender of a message and the receiver of a message. And as we're trying to address discrimination, as we're trying to be non-discriminatory, we want to recognize that we as a speaker have a set of experiences, and we as the receiver have a set of experiences, and they may not be the same. So when a speaker says something, the receiver may hear something different. Our intent may be one thing, our impact may be another. And whose responsibility is it to make sure that the message that is sent actually gets across? The sender, yes. Not the receiver, the sender. So we need to remember that. We as a receiver of a message need to provide feedback so that the sender knows that we received the message. So along with that, we want to recognize the research shows that meaning that comes from the words we use. Meaning is derived only 7% from the spoken word, 7% from the actual word itself, 38% from how the word was said, how the word was spoken, and 55% from the facial expression on the person uttering those words. So as we look to not be discriminatory, we need to keep this in mind. We need to think about difficult conversations. And as we said, we're going to have a whole session on these, but I wanted to highlight that every conversation has every difficult conversation has three conversations going on in it. One conversation about what happened, the facts of the matter. Joe Friday's just the facts man. Another conversation about the feelings engendered by what was said. Another conversation about the identity of the person who said it or the person who received the message. And the way to address these difficult conversations is to come at them from a learning stance, shifting to a learning stance, an inquisitive stance, an active listening stance. Understand what the other person is saying before you try to make your own message, make your own point. Decision making. There are different models of decision making, different steps along the way. Implicit bias can crop up in every single step of the way. So you want to make sure that as you look at your steps of your decision-making processes, you ask, how has implicit bias crept into this process? So actions you can take. Interpersonal actions you can take. Learn the truth about where we are with people of different races, with people of different genders. Commit to taking action about racial reconciliation in particular. Commit to taking action. Don't just think, well, I'll take action. Commit to taking action. Join a group. I'm president of the Manchester NAACP. I'd love you to join our group, but there are so many other groups that are doing work. Rights and Democracy, AFSC, the American Friends Service, so many other groups. Join one. De-bias yourself. We talked about that. Take an active bystander training session. I delivered one just last week. Look at practices, policies, laws, procedures at the local, state, federal levels, and in your organizations. Contact your representatives about laws that you think are discriminatory. Call out discrimination when you see it. Don't just let it happen. And for a little wrap up, we talked about what welcoming, belonging environments are. We've talked about some definitions and what makes us discriminatory. We talked about levels of discrimination and reinforcement. We talked about how to become less discriminatory. So many things we covered, so many things we could have covered. But I hope that at least we've given you a few pearls of wisdom that you can take with you about how to recognize discrimination and how to address it. So I'm going to stop and take any questions that might pop up.
James, this was fabulous. I've been taking notes nonstop. So many pearls of wisdom. So how about we blow up the chat with thanks for James for sharing his wisdom and insights. And as a reminder, I want to let you know that the recording of this session and the slides will be shared at volunteernewhampshire.org. We will send you all an email when they're posted. So make sure that we're on your safe senders list. Registration is still open for the remaining conference sessions. So you do have to sign up session by session. Aislinn, if you could post the link to James' next session again, because I certainly will be making sure I'm registered for that one. And Aislinn will also be posting a session feedback form. We love to hear your thoughts on this session and any others you attend. You can come back to the survey multiple times or wait until the end of the conference. The link is the same regardless. If you fill out the survey by May 31st, you will be entered into the drawing to win a prize. And for another chance to win, you can also submit an intent to nominate form for the 2021 Spirit of New Hampshire Awards. This is your opportunity to recognize an outstanding volunteer, group of volunteers, or an organization that champions volunteerism. And Aislinn will put that into the chat as well. Now, just to be clear, filling out the form doesn't count as nominating. We will reach out to you with the actual nomination form when we are accepting nominations. And I also encourage you to enjoy the rest of the conference and come back and see us even on Friday, because on Friday we're going to do a conference summary where I'll be leading a trivia session We have a chance to win 3 different prizes, first, second, and third. And we'll also be doing a reflection exercise to really tie a bow around all the things you've learned at the conference. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again, James. Really appreciate
Thank you,
everything you
James.
did. And we will see you tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday.